When Attorney General Ashcroft announced Friday he was postponing the execution of Timothy McVeigh for 30 days, postponing it because the FBI had failed to turn over 3,000 pages of documents to the McVeigh defense team before his trial, Ashcroft did not concede for a moment that McVeigh was not guilty of committing the most heinous crime in U.S. history, the 1995 bombing of the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. The explosion killed 168 people and injured more than 600. McVeigh, at one time a sergeant in the United States Army, has admitted his guilt, saying his only regret was that he didn't take down the entire building. Tonight, Timothy McVeigh, in the one and only television interview he has ever given, conducted a year ago when he was appealing his death penalty sentence. At the time, his attorney would not let McVeigh admit he was the Oklahoma City bomber, even though he had been convicted. But he did talk about the bombing, his anger at the government, and what may have motivated the attack. Last week, before the announcement of the delay, we went to Oklahoma City to hear from the people most affected, family members and survivors, who are deeply divided on whether McVeigh should be executed at all and whether anyone should be able to watch it on television. McVeigh is now scheduled to be executed on June 11th, and if that happens, he will be the first federal prisoner in 38 years to be put to death. Are you prepared for death?
I am. I came to terms with my mortality in the Gulf War. After that, it's not that hard to be, quote, prepared for death.
But there's a little different experience being in a war as opposed to being in prison on death row, knowing that there will be a lethal injection that will take your life.
In truth, from my psychological perspective, it's a little easier being on death row because you know how you're going to die. You can narrow down where you're going to die, and you can pretty much narrow down the time.
7 a.m. to be exact. That's when McVeigh is set to be strapped on this table in the death chamber of the U.S. Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, in 30 days, and injected with a sedative which will put him to sleep. He'll then get a lethal dose of pancuronium bromide to collapse his lungs and potassium chloride to stop his heart. The drugs will take between 4 and 8 minutes to kill him. We talked with 8 family members and survivors of the bombing and showed them our interview with McVeigh. Most of them believe that death by lethal injection is the easy way out for Timothy McVeigh.
How many people in this lifetime get to leave this world pain-free? There is pain associated with death, but once again, McVeigh takes the coward's way out, and he gets to leave this world. He's going to be rolled in and fall asleep and drift off into eternity.
Kathy Wilburn's 2 grandchildren, Chase and Colton Smith, were killed in the bombing.
The whole thing just makes me so mad. You know, we get the letters to show up for the execution. It says that the execution will take place at 7 o'clock. If you want to attend, you got to be there at 4:30 in the morning. It's like, once again, Tim McVeigh wins. He's the only one going to get to sleep late.
Janie Coverdale also lost her 2 grandchildren, Aaron and Elijah Coverdale, who were playing in the daycare center inside the federal building.
He'll be at peace. Where are we going to be? Still? He'll
Always going to be at peace.
I agree. I disagree with that. He'll be somewhere. He'll be somewhere. But we are going to be going through just as much hell as Timothy McVeigh for the rest of our lives.
Am I pure evil? Am I the face of terror sitting here in front of you? Or am I able to talk to you man to man?
Most people in this country think you are the face of evil, don't they?
They do. But sitting down here now, and let me make clear, I'm not sitting here trying to influence you. And I'm not putting on a game face. I'm not conning anybody. I'm just being me. And maybe people will listen. Maybe one of the benefits of me talking to you today is that you'll see that maybe not everything is true that you've heard about me.
What people have been hearing about Timothy McVeigh since the publication last month of a new book about the bombing is a detailed account, in McVeigh's own words, of how he spent 9 months meticulously planning the attack, amassing fuses, fuel oil, ammonium nitrate, and other materials for his homemade bomb. how he rented a Ryder truck under an assumed name, loaded it with 7,000 pounds of explosives, took a nap, ate some spaghetti, and how he then drove the truck to the federal building, lit the fuse, and walked away. Minutes later, the 9-story structure was in ruins. Among the dead were 19 children. Most of them had been playing at the daycare center. 8 federal law enforcement agents, 35 employees of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, 16 employees of the Social Security Administration, and more than 80 other people who just happened to be in the building that Wednesday morning.
Everyone in America saw the pictures on television, heard the news on the radio. What was your reaction when you saw those pictures?
I think like everyone else, I thought it was a tragic event.
And the children?
I thought it was terrible that there were children in the building.
Tim McVeigh is full of it. He said it was terrible about the children. He had been to the daycare center. He had talked to the director of the daycare center. He knew those children were there.
McVeigh is quoted in the book as referring to the children killed in the daycare center as collateral damage.
So when he said that if he had known that there was a daycare center, that might have given him pause to change his target.
Which he was lying. He was lying.
Arlene Blanchard was a sergeant working in the Army recruiting office. She was seriously injured by shrapnel from the blast.
He's a soldier. And before a soldier does a mission, they do a recon. He thought this plan out. He is trying to portray himself in a light that he could soften the blow of the way people view him when he says, I didn't know that there were children in the building, which was a blatant lie.
Roy Sells lost his wife, Lee. They had been married for 37 years. She was killed in her office at the Department of Housing and Urban Development.
What was the reaction that you had when you realized that the main suspect in this bombing was an American?
I wanted it to be some foreign terrorist because I just didn't want to believe that one of our own would do that.
Here I am in the building serving my country. I was in the military for 11 years, and to think that someone who has taken the same oath that I have to protect, serve, and defend my country with our lives, and then to turn around and to do something like this, to me it was the highest degree of treason.
When I saw them leading Timothy McVeigh out of Perry County Jail and realized that it was an American, I felt very betrayed because I didn't think Americans did anything like that. I thought we were more civilized.
We had just gotten home from the funeral home to pick out a casket to bury my daughter's children in, Chase and Colton. And when I looked at the TV, I thought, what happened to that young man that he got so twisted? What happened in his life that would cause him to do something so evil?
What was that like for you that day? I mean, walking, people were shouting at you. I remember somebody had shouted out, "Baby killer."
You go into a mode where you try to block external stimuli out. You're gearing up for anything to happen mentally, but at the same time you're putting on your poker face because you're aware of how the media nitpicks at every little emotion that comes across on a face. You don't want to give them anything to feed off of.
Timothy McVeigh's trial included hours of wrenching testimony from victims describing the carnage after the explosion. Through it all, McVeigh sat stone-faced.
I was raised in an environment where men don't cry. You hold it back. It's one of the things that a guy learns, is how to hold back tears and not let it be shown.
How did Timothy McVeigh, a 33-year-old man with no previous criminal record, end up convicted of the worst act of domestic terrorism in American history? His childhood offers few clues. He grew up in Pendleton, New York, a small town near Buffalo. His mother, Mildred, left the family when he was just a boy, and he was raised mostly by his father, Bill, a factory worker. Overall, McVeigh says he was a happy kid.
In your high school yearbook, under future plans, you wrote, and I'm quoting here,
Okay.
"Take it as it comes, buy a Lamborghini, California girls."
Right. Well, I'm dreaming. I'm putting down my dreams, you know. If I could rub a genie in a bottle, that's what I wish for, right? So.
Sitting there talking to him, there were times when I'd look at him and think that this is a guy who is not unlike millions of guys in this country. Mm-hmm. You'd never look at and give him a second look. And then there were times when I would look at him and I would be hit with the realization, this guy is a cold-blooded killer.
Yeah. He was your guy next door. Everyone that knew Timothy McVeigh liked him, talked about his good personality and how funny he was. You know, that's what makes him really scary.
Bud Welch, whose only child, 23-year-old Julie, was killed in the blast, says what is scary to him was that on that day, McVeigh was ready to die for his cause.
I don't think he was any different than a suicide bomber in the Middle East.
Yeah.
He drove a Ryder truck, an unfamiliar vehicle, with a 7,000-pound homemade bomb behind his head from Kansas to Oklahoma. And I think that Wednesday morning he'd have been willing to go down with that truck had it become necessary. And he also said that he was afraid that the bomb wasn't going to go off and he was going to have to go back and shoot it with his .45 caliber pistol. Had he done that, he knew he would have died.
Timothy McVeigh was trained to kill in the United States Army. He served in the Persian Gulf War, where he was awarded several medals for heroism.
In the Gulf, you saw combat?
I did.
You fired a weapon at the Iraqis?
Yes.
And killed soldiers?
Yes. In some ways, I could see the right and wrong of it. The right, I thought, well, it was self-defense. The reason I fired is because I saw a muzzle flash, and I instinctively fired around in that direction. But then I thought, well, at the same time, I'm in this person's country. What right did I have to come over to his country and kill him? How did he ever transgress against me?
Well, my question is, what did we in Oklahoma City do to transgress against him?
Susan Walton was making a deposit in the credit union when the bomb went off. She's had more than a dozen operations and is permanently disabled.
I mean, he killed innocent women and children that their only crime was trying to make this a better world.
By the time he bombed the federal building, McVeigh's world had unraveled. He says his experience in the Gulf War was the beginning of his transformation from loyal soldier to alienated critic of his government.
I went over there hyped up, just like everyone else. Not only is Saddam evil, all Iraqis are evil. What I experienced, though, was an entirely different ballgame. And being face-to-face, close with these people, in personal contact, you realize they're just people like you.
It's hard for some people to come to grips with you as the same person who was commended by the Army, who received the Bronze Star, who received the Combat Medal, as being the same person who was convicted in the Oklahoma City bombing. They can't put the two together. You understand that?
I do understand. They perceive, and many people have thrown this at me, they say, well, Tim, imagine the paradox. In the Gulf War, you were given medals for killing people. So I've faced that issue quite a few times with people that bring it up to me.
And how do you explain it, then?
At that point, usually I just leave it at that and say that it is an interesting paradox.
McVeigh chose not to re-enlist in the Army and was honorably discharged in 1991.
So is it fair to say that you were disillusioned when you came back? I mean, is that why you left the Army?
It's part of it. I'm sure something didn't feel right in me, but I couldn't quantify it. I couldn't say what it was.
Whatever it was, Timothy McVeigh was becoming increasingly resentful towards his government. He returned home to upstate New York and wrote a letter to his local newspaper saying, in part, that democracy was on the verge of failure and that, quote, America is in serious decline. You ended that letter with the words, "Do we have to shed blood to reform the current system?" I hope it doesn't come to that, but it might.
Right.
Sounds like you were pretty angry when you came back.
I believe I had anger welling in me, yes.
Timothy McVeigh's anger would erupt 4 years later in Oklahoma City, forever changing the lives of hundreds of victims and their families. If you were in a room with Timothy McVeigh, what would you say to him?
I'd say, Tim, why don't you be a man for one time and stand up and tell me why you bombed that building?
I'd get on my knees and beg him to give us the names of the other people involved in the bombing.
What I would try to do is I'd take a picture of Julie, and I'd try to place a face on one of the 168 that he killed. And I'd want to point out to him that he and Julie were only 3.5 years apart in age, and had they been raised in the same neighborhood, they might possibly have even been buddies. And my motive would be to try to put a crack in him to where he would start talking and tell us more. And I want so bad for him to ask for forgiveness before he dies.
Timothy McVeigh has not asked for forgiveness. In fact, he has expressed no sympathy or remorse for what he did. He told his father recently he has nothing to apologize for. When we come back, McVeigh tells us what motivated the Oklahoma City bombing, and we will hear more from the family members and survivors, some of whom bitterly disagree with each other over whether McVeigh deserves to die for what he did. When Timothy McVeigh is walked into the death chamber at the U.S. Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, there will be 25 witnesses present, 10 family members and survivors, 10 representatives of the media, and 5 people McVeigh himself gets to select. The execution will also be broadcast live via closed-circuit television to some 300 victims and relatives in Oklahoma City. Before he is put to death, McVeigh will be permitted to make a final statement. He is planning to recite a line from a 19th century poem. "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." He is also expected to declare himself the winner in his war against America, saying the final score is 168-1. I know you've had a lot of time to sit here and think.
Yes.
If you had your life to live over, is there anything you'd do differently?
I've thought about that quite a few times, and I think anybody in life says, I wish I could have gone back and done this differently, done that differently. There are moments, but no one that stands out.
Certainly not the Oklahoma City bombing. That chilling indifference, which McVeigh expressed to us when we talked to him on death row, was echoed recently in a book in which he is quoted boasting that the bombing was his act of revenge against the federal government. McVeigh says several key events caused him to, in his words, snap, beginning in 1992 when federal agents killed the wife and young child of white supremacist Randy Weaver during a standoff at Ruby Ridge, Idaho. Tell me what it is about that shootout at Ruby Ridge that concerns you.
I could say the use of what is no more or less snipers in a domestic non-wartime situation, federal agents taking on the role of judge, jury, and executioner. And then to further add insult to injury, you have these people, these federal agents, not held accountable. They become immune from the law.
McVeigh says his hostility toward the U.S. government solidified 8 months later during another standoff, this one at Waco, Texas. There, more than 70 members of the Branch Davidian sect, including 24 children, died in a fire after a bloody clash with federal agents. At one point during the 51-day siege, McVeigh traveled to Waco to witness events firsthand, and he happened to be videotaped there by a local news crew. What impact did it have on you actually being there and looking at it?
Shaken, disillusioned, angered, that could happen in this country where our core beliefs are freedom and liberty. And what did you do to these people? You deprived them of life, liberty, and property. You didn't guarantee those rights, you deprived them of them.
What is so ironic and so shocking is McVeigh's concern for the children inside the Branch Davidian compound, who were among those tear-gassed by government agents.
The thing that hits me the hardest about that is the CS gas. Just knowing what it does, and knowing as some adults can barely breathe because of it. When I saw it introduced into a building full of kids like that, it just, the emotions it brings up make me speechless.
There are a lot of people who are upset by that, who would say, yeah, what happened there is wrong, but those are isolated incidents. That was just Ruby Ridge and Waco. What would you say to that?
I would say I don't necessarily believe that to be true. I think for people that follow the news and follow events, there are patterns of abuse evident.
And according to Timothy McVeigh, it is up to the citizens of the United States to do whatever is necessary to keep their government in check.
What do you think is the appropriate way for a citizen of this country to express his or her displeasure with the government?
There are many options.
Is violence an acceptable option?
If government is the teacher, violence would be an acceptable option.
What do you mean?
Well, what did we do to Sudan? What did we do to Afghanistan? Belgrade? What are we doing with the death penalty? It appears they use violence as an option all the time.
So if the government uses this, it's okay for us as citizens to use it?
I'll let my explanation stand for itself.
McVeigh says that violence is an appropriate way for a citizen to register disapproval of the government.
He wants to be portrayed as a soldier and one that has courage, when actuality he's a coward. And he said something about liberty and freedom. Everything that he was supposed to stand for was just the opposite. He became the judge, juror, and the executioner.
How do you react to McVeigh in talking about this incident, in which he says if he had to live his life over again, he wouldn't do anything differently? I mean, this is something that changed all of your lives forever. And he says he has no regrets.
I think he'd do the same thing over again. I think he got the results that he wanted to get. I think the only thing that he's probably sorry was he didn't blow the whole building down and kill everybody in it.
And that's what's really scary, is to know that we share this planet with people that have that kind of views. There are people in cell groups around the country that believe like this, and Timothy McVeigh is going to go down in history to them as a martyr.
McVeigh told us that one person in America with whom he can identify is another notorious criminal, the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski. The two were incarcerated 2 years ago in the same cell block at a federal penitentiary in Colorado.
Did you ever talk to Kaczynski?
I did.
Do you think that you and he share similar concerns about how the government operates these days?
We have somewhat different views, but there is some common ground there.
Kaczynski recently wrote a letter about McVeigh in which he called the Oklahoma City bombing, quote, a bad action because it was unnecessarily inhumane. Still, Kaczynski said he liked McVeigh and thought he had excellent social skills.
I found that, in a way that I didn't realize, that we were much alike in that all we ever wanted, or all we wanted out of life, was the freedom to live our own lives, however we chose to. And he expressed that one day, and it hit me that, well, you know, this labeling, he's far left, I'm far right, that's all out the window. There's a lot more commonality there.
You both think you had lost the freedom to live your life the way you wanted to, and you think that the government took those freedoms from you?
From my perspective, I believe that it's a problem with government. From Ted's perspective, he believes it's a problem with technology.
While Ted Kaczynski is serving a life sentence without parole for his crimes, Timothy McVeigh will become the first federal prisoner to be executed since 1963. The majority of Americans are in favor of the death penalty. Still, it is one issue that bitterly divides the nation, as it does some of the family members and survivors of the Oklahoma City bombing. How do you all feel about the death penalty? Show of hands, who's for it? 6 of them want McVeigh to be executed. 2 are adamantly opposed. What's the argument against executing him? This is a man who committed the worst act of terrorism on American soil.
Tim McVeigh has been rendered harmless where he is, and I see no gain whatsoever in taking him out of that cage to kill him.
There was a time when and correct me if I'm wrong, that after this happened, when your feeling was that you thought McVeigh should fry, if I'm quoting you
That's correct.
correctly, for killing your daughter.
I look back on that period of time now, and I recognize that that's a period of temporary insanity, and I finally recognize that at some point, the day that we might execute Tim McVeigh would be an act of vengeance and rage, and vengeance and rage is exactly why Julie Marie Welch and 167 others are dead, and Tim McVeigh killed 168 people because he's full of rage and vengeance, and it did not help him one bit to kill those 168 people. He's still living with it, and apparently he's going to die with it.
Are you saying we were insane?
I'm saying I had temporary insanity.
Okay.
The first about that
Now
bombing.
what else you're saying is we want Tim dead out of vengeance and rage.
You're not wanting to watch him take his last breath to forgive him.
Is
I'm
that
sure
what
of that.
you were saying?
You think I've got rage?
Let me tell you something.
I think you want retribution.
No, I don't want retribution. Timothy McVeigh is not the only one in this country. There's thousands of them here.
I know that.
It's not vengeance and rage. It's justice. And if it was left up to me, all of them would be
Janie,
gone.
you're going to have the same anger after his death.
I didn't say I was going to feel better,
Well,
but
I just asked you the
wait
question.
a minute.
Are you going to feel better?
I'll know that Tim McVeigh will never hurt another child, and I don't have to hear Tim McVeigh's mouth anymore, and I don't have to read anything else that Tim McVeigh has said.
Do you think that as long as he remains alive, that he poses a threat to you psychologically or in some other way?
To some of us psychologically, yes. Yep. Because every time I feel that maybe I'm making one step forward, Timothy McVeigh pipes up and says something that sends me right back where I was. My anger that I thought I had under control resurfaces.
I believe that there's no punishment that we as actual human beings could administer to him that would be appropriate for what he has done, and that is something that's going to be handled between him and Almighty God. That's why God said, vengeance is mine.
Are any of you concerned that by executing him that we turn Timothy McVeigh into a martyr?
He will only be a martyr to those people that think like he thinks.
He's already a martyr.
That's right. He's already a martyr to them, so
killing him won't make any difference.
It won't make any difference.
Some people say that it'd be tougher on him to rot in jail for the rest of his life.
I agree with that.
If somebody could prove to me that they could put him back here in a cell with nobody to talk to, he could not talk to nobody, he could not talk to the media, he could not write a book, he could not do these things, I'd say leave that sucker there.
Those who were inside the federal building when it was bombed and those whose family members died in the blast may be the largest and most powerful group of survivors of a crime in American history. Many of them successfully lobbied for passage of a federal bill that sharply restricts the appeals of death row inmates. They also won a legal battle to have Timothy McVeigh's trial shown on closed-circuit television in Oklahoma City. And now they have been granted permission to watch McVeigh's execution on TV live via satellite. What do you say to someone who would say that watching this on television, even on closed-circuit television, is barbaric? It's obscene. It's like people gathering in the town square to watch a public hanging.
I don't think that it's going to be a big, joyful day there. That's not a joyful occasion to see a person die. The only thing that I think I'll get out of it is that is the last chapter in his life for me.
Is it really possible to achieve closure by watching another man die?
I despise the word closure because there is no closure to what happened here.
Right.
Calvin Mosier, who worked for the Department of Housing and Urban Development, was seriously injured in the bombing.
The only closure to me will be when I'm put away in my grave. And I feel that I have an obligation to go and see the execution for the friends that I lost, knowing they would do the same for me.
Doesn't he in the end have the last word? He goes out the way he wants to go out, and you will have to hear and live with the last words that Timothy McVeigh speaks.
He can't hurt me any worse than what he's already hurt me. So whatever he says, he's not going to have a last word. I'm going to have a last word. If God's with me, I'm going to live past that day. And I'm going to have the last word, not him.
Timothy McVeigh's last word will have to wait for a while, and so will the victims and families we spoke with just a few days before the announcement of the delay in McVeigh's execution. That announcement, they told us, left them stunned and deeply hurt and angered at the mistake of the FBI that led to it. One of the victims we interviewed, Calvin Mosier, said on Friday, "I think he's sitting in his cell and laughing. He's saying, 'I've done it one more time.'"